host of courses that I enjoy teaching.
Wow, that's a real variety there.
Yeah, I think it's like being in an education school, it's so multidisciplinary. It allows you that flexibility to explore things. Like I'm not, I mean, I work with a lot of economists, but I'm not trained as one. So I dabble in different disciplines.
So you're in at Stanford?
No, so I did my degree at Stanford. I'm at U Ottawa. That's where I'm a professor. I'm an assistant professor in Ottawa.
Sorry, your voice is...
What place did you say?
University of Ottawa in Canada.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Sarthik. So Sonia Balotra, she was like, sorry, I can't join, but my PhD student, and he's just finishing, right? And you also work in economics of education. So highly recommended by Sonia, and very happy to have you. Thanks so much.
No, thank you for having me. I mean, this is a rare opportunity for like a student to participate. So I'm very, very thankful. Yeah, no, looking forward to it.
Nice to meet you, Sarthak.
And you. Yeah.
Okay, so shall we start, Manya?
So I can see Christina is part of the attendees. She's not part of the panel.
Yeah, Christina joined as an attendee. So maybe Manya, if you could communicate.
She does have the link as a panelist. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great.
Well, there's some confusion which link to use. You get a couple of different links, and
Yeah.
Thanks so much for fixing that.
Christina. It's like
5 a.m.
It's early, but yeah, excited to see everyone. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So shall we start, Manya?
Yes, please. Thank you.
All right, so welcome everyone in this second session of CREB External Seminar Series. Let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Minahil Asim. I am a postdoc researcher at University of Oxford, and I would be chairing today's session. Before I formally start today's session, I would like to thank the organizers for putting this all together. Thanks to CREB staff, thanks to the Lahore School of Economics. So in today's session is dedicated to economics of education. We have one keynote speaker with us, Minahil Asim, who is an assistant professor at University of Ottawa, and she extensively works on economics of education. We have two panelists with us, Christina Brown, who is a postdoc at University of Chicago, and Sarthik, who is doing his final year of PhD at University of Warwick. Very happy to have you all. Thanks so much for joining us from very different time zones. And so let me just briefly walk you through the structure of today's session. So Minahil would take 20 to 25 minutes, followed by discussion by me and Christina, and then we will open the floor for question and answer session. All right, so Minahil, without a further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Shaheen. So I may take a little longer than that. I prepared for a 30-minute talk, but I will try to squeeze it in 20 minutes because I'd really like to hear from the panelists. Thank you for inviting me, everybody at LSE and CREB. Especially thank you to Christina, who has heard versions of this talk, of this presentation at multiple different fora, and she's still here at 5 a.m. So thank you, Christina, for coming. And Sarthak, very, very nice to see you. I'm also really happy to have Vatsal here, who's my co-author on this paper. So if there's softball questions, I will take them. But if there's anything complicated, Vatsal is going to answer them. Let me just say that up front. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see? Is that okay? Okay, great. So this is a project where we try to understand the role of teacher expectations and how they influence student outcomes. This is joint work with Vatsal, who's here as a panelist, and Ronak, who I see in the audience as well. They're, brilliant academics and also my very dear friends. It's always good to have a project with friends. So the idea that students' classroom performance can be influenced by what their teachers expect of them is not a new one. In psychology, this is referred to as the Pygmalion effect, which is that if teachers have high expectations of how students will perform, those create self-fulfilling prophecies and students end up performing better. So this is the backdrop in kind of how, in which we situate our paper. In settings such as Pakistan, where teachers are held in high regard, we anticipate and suspect that these expectations matter even more. So in our baseline survey, we found that 65% of the teachers rank their encouragement as being really important for the students to improve their academic achievement. And also parents report that they would, 84% of the parents report that it would be extremely useful or very useful if a teacher set and conveyed an expectation to their child. However, there's also past literature that suggests that, let alone teachers' expectations, there are contexts where students may not even have information about their academic performance. And the studies that I've quoted, one of them is from Pakistan, where the information potentially has larger effects on student improvements. And lastly, we also know very little about how these expectations can be strengthened by leveraging friendships within the classroom. So how do peer effects influence this role of teacher expectations on student achievement? So with that motivation, our big research question is, how do students' academic achievement and non-cognitive outcomes respond to high expectations of their teachers? And to understand this, we ask these three sub-questions. Does this depend on the framing and level of teacher expectations? Can peer effects strengthen the effect of teacher expectations? And finally, how does these effects compare to the effect of information about current performance? We think that our project makes two important contributions to both the literature and policy on improving educational outcomes for students. The first is that we use a field experiment to understand the impact of communicating high teacher expectations. The past research that we've cited here, it hasn't used causal inference to understand the role of expectations, and part of that reason is that expectations are endogenous. People are continuously updating them, and they're also rarely explicitly communicated, especially in contexts like Pakistan or other low and middle income countries. Our second contribution is that we propose a simple, sustained, contextualized, and easy to implement method to motivate student achievement, and also pretty low cost, because past research has also looked at some easy to implement mechanisms, but largely the literature has focused on rewards-based, tangible financial incentives to improve and motivate student performance. Additionally, we feel we try to situate our work within the larger literature on goal setting, which has so far shown us mixed evidence on improving student outcomes. So the goals are sometimes set by students themselves, but here we try to see if teachers set certain kinds of goals and the level and the framing of the goals and how they influence student outcomes. And finally, we also like to give a nod to the literature on US charter schools or other similar programs where teacher expectations are a component of larger programs, but those don't necessarily tell us what the role of standalone teacher expectations is on student outcomes. So the evaluation incorporates multiple other components. So that's how we think that we are contributing to literature and policy. So to study this, we partnered with a large private school chain in Pakistan, which caters to middle and upper middle income families. Our intervention was implemented completely remotely in 2021 during COVID in 288 classrooms across 15 schools, and we worked with 131 mathematics teachers. Like I said, this study was implemented during COVID, where there were very limited interactions between students themselves and between students and teachers. So just to give you a sense of what the data looks like about this context. So teachers report that students had not been very interactive or motivated in the last term. When we asked them, absenteeism was high. Teachers were giving warning for low attendance, and 35% of the classes received warnings for incomplete homework in the last term. And this is, I want to emphasize that we only worked with mathematics teachers and mathematics classrooms. So this is a snapshot of what our sample looks like. 41% of the students in our sample are female. 84% of them speak Urdu at home. On average, they're spending between 3 to 4 hours a week working on mathematics. We also see that students are 95% of the students want to get better at math, and they feel that their peers can motivate them to do better. So this forms a nice backdrop into the intervention that we propose. So our research design, as a first step, we remind current math teachers of the latest score of every student in their classroom, and then we elicit their expectations. So we ask them to fill out these 2 statements in light of the score of their student, and we remind them that they should think of this as a realistic expectation, taking into account the most recent test score of their student. So the first statement, I expect the student to work hard and improve to achieve at least X in upcoming exams and tests. We frame this as a high expectation compared to the second statement, which can be considered as an upper bound of their expectation, where the teacher tells us that they think that even Y, like even this large goal, large amount is achievable in the upcoming exams and tests. So this is what we do as a first step. After we've elicited expectations, we used a clustered randomization design at the classroom level. So we have 288 classrooms in our sample with approximately 1,600 students. And we divided these classrooms into 3 equal groups: the control, the individual, and the peer treatment. And I'll just talk about the details of these treatment arms in a bit. The control classroom, we also divided into 2 groups. So a no information group, which receives absolutely no information, and an information group, because remember from our research questions, we're also interested in understanding what happens if you just receive information about your scores. And in the individual and the peer treatment arm, we randomly assign students to one of the 2 statements that we elicited from the teacher. So either a statement of high expectation or a very high expectation. So this is broadly our clustered randomization design. This is the timeline of the intervention. So we started we started way before this, but conducted our baseline surveys from March to May in 2021, and also administered a low stakes independent test, which was done through CERB, our research team at CERB. The intervention happened from May to June in 2021. And then, so here I've listed high stakes exam in June 2021 and high stakes exam in December 2021. And these are kind of the main outcomes, academic achievement outcomes that we looked at. So after the midline surveys and exams, we also reminded students of, with the intervention before conducting the endline survey. So what is the intervention? In the individual treatment arm, we emailed students their most recent test score and their teacher's expectation. Again, whether you were randomly assigned a high or a very high expectation. So, if you're a student, if you're a girl, you received this image over here where it says, I am here, is your most recent score on your math test. And here next to the flag, you're given the expectation from your teacher. Either it's a very high or a high expectation. And on the staircase, you can see that there are certain tips that the students are given. And these tips we got from the teachers when we did their survey about how they think the students can achieve the expectation that they have of them. So we emailed this to the students, and just I should have mentioned this earlier, but this entire intervention is happening online because the school chain that we worked with had a very nice system of online education delivery set up. They were using Google Classrooms and Zoom links or Google Meet links to engage with the students. So we kind of used their existing infrastructure and implemented this intervention. So emailed students these images. In the peer treatment arm, we randomly matched classmates of the same gender, keeping in mind the cultural context. So girls were matched with girls, boys were matched with boys, and they were sent the email of their individual expectations, so the image on the previous slide. And then the matched pair was also sent in a joint email, which looked like this. It had no expectation or score on it, but it had an additional line that said, "We hope you both will encourage each other." So again, a very light touch intervention to make people aware of what their teacher expects of them, and encourage in the peer treatment arm, encourage two people to work towards a goal. In the information arm, we sent them a placebo image, which basically just said, "I am here, this is my current score," and then there's a pure control that received no information. We sent reminders. So after we conducted the intervention finished, we conducted our midline surveys, and we got access to the high stakes tests that they had done in June. We updated the students' score using their performance on the midline exam, and then we again sent them reminders using this image. And here, just for variety, we used the image with boys. So we basically tell them where they are right now and what their teacher expects them to achieve, and use the same tips that they received in the previous round. Similarly, for the peer arm, they received the individual expectation, and then they also received a joint email, the two kids who were paired together, and asked that, we hope you both will encourage each other. And similarly, in the information arm, they just received a placebo image with their updated score from the midline tests, and were given, the reminder that you are here, and there's an exam that's coming up. So our main regression is listed on the slide. We run it on pre-specified outcomes. The trial is registered in the AR registry. So we basically use our treatment indicator dummies. The standard errors are clustered at the class level, and we include strata fixed effects for each strata. And we can talk more about that if there are questions. So what do we find? The expectations work. So we find that in the individual treatment arm, students who received just the first image with their teacher's expectation, they score approximately 0.2 standard deviations higher than a pure control. We don't find any average effects on the peer treatment arm. However, we do find a 0.2 standard deviation effect of the information arm, of just getting information on student test scores compared to a pure control. We find that these effects persist at the end line. So after they received the second round of reminders, we find that at the end line exam, about 0.18 standard deviations, students in the individual arm score 0.18 standard deviations higher than a pure control. We don't find any average effects in the peer treatment arm. In the information arm, we find that the effect is about 0.12 standard deviations higher. Though it's statistically insignificant, we can't rule out that the individual arm is different from the information arm here. So overall, we see that effects for both the individual and the information arm, they're persisting in the long run. Here we've just plotted the trajectory of the scores. So there's a baseline score, the midline, which was in June 2021 after a COVID wave. So we do see some COVID-induced learning losses. And then the end line, which happened in December 2021. So we see a recovery in all arms. But the thing to note here is that in the individual treatment arm, the slope here is the smallest compared to the others, and the recovery in some ways the sharpest. So this is what we can compare all the other groups with each other. So we also looked at the effects on English scores. And again, the intervention primarily focused on math. So we can think of English scores as spillovers, or as, in a way to explain if there's some kind of effort substitution happening. So in the individual treatment arm, we see that there's a positive, again, effect on math scores, but there is a positive and, significant at the 10% level on the English test scores as well. So there is evidence of positive spillovers in English. However, in end line, we see that there's actually a negative effect of the intervention on the English test scores. So especially in the peer treatment arm, we can see that there's a strong negative effect on the English test scores, which could be, we suspect, because students are substituting their effort because they receive this information about the expectation of doing better at math. They're perhaps substituting effort from English and just focusing on math. And that leads to a negative effect on their English test scores. So just to summarize the main results, we found that communicating high teacher expectations increases student performance in the short and the long term. But information about performance also leads to equivalent improvements in student performance. And I've showed average effects, but we also look at distributional effects, quantile treatment effects, and happy to talk more about those if we have time at the end. We also find suggestive evidence of effort substitution over time as English scores are decreasing for treated participants. We find that the peer arm has no average effects on short and long terms. And we also, like I had mentioned, we've conducted surveys on looking at non-cognitive outcomes and low-stake maths test. But the sample size for the survey is really small, and we're not powered to detect any results there. But happy to talk more about this at the end. But we still haven't answered these three questions, or we still don't understand these three things. Does the content and framing of teacher expectations matter? We don't know why the peer arm does not have an average effect. And we're also very puzzled why the information arm, it's leading to large effects as big as the individual treatment arm. So we'll try to unpack some of that, and then we're open to comments and suggestions from you on things that we can do. So here, remember, we also randomly assigned students within each of the treatment groups into a very high and a high expectation. So here we see that the average effect of being assigned a very high expectation is about 0.25 standard deviations higher, and also a positive significant effect on English. So what this is suggesting is that if you're receiving a very high goal from the teacher, unlike most literature on frustrated aspirations, which talks about the fact that if students set very high goals, they may become frustrated and not end up performing really well, we find evidence to the contrary. So if you do receive a very high expectation, there is a positive and significant effect on your outcomes. And we see that these effects persist in the long term. So especially for very high expectations, if you received that, you end up scoring higher at the end line as well. And we can see that the effect on English is negative, but statistically insignificant for both these groups. But important to note that setting a very high expectation actually works. So what's happening in the peer arm? There's no average effect, but we were able to match peers on certain characteristics. So here, what we're measuring is that what if you were matched with somebody who had a similar score to you, a lower score than you, or a score higher than you? And we find that most of the effects in the peer treatment arm are if you are matched with someone who is of the same ability as you. And I use the term ability loosely, same baseline academic achievement than you. So these are huge effects. Like if you're paired with somebody who is of similar ability, you're scoring approximately 0.5 standard deviations higher than a pure control. There's some effect if the peer score is lower, but if you're scored with somebody higher, there's actually negative effects on your scores. We see that in the end line, these effects die down, but it's interesting to see here that if you're paired with somebody who is not similar to you, the effect on the negative spillover on English is actually higher. So overall, the story here is that if you're paired with somebody with the same ability as you, you're likely to score better. And we didn't just look at baseline achievement as the only measure of similarities. So we also looked at intrinsic motivation, wealth, and also whether or not if you're matched with somebody who is your friend, and we find similar effects. So the more similar the peer is, the better this intervention works for you. So what is happening in the information arm? We know a few things, but we also don't know many things here. So here we spoke to our partner schools, and we realized that there are differences in parental literacy in terms of the schools that we worked with. They're in different cities. They have a different mode in the way that grades may be communicated to them. So here we have some suggestive evidence that says that if you are in a school where parental literacy is low, the information seems to benefit you. So here, like this effect is negative but insignificant, but in the end line, we see there is some suggestive evidence that if you are in a school where parental literacy is low, or they may not be able to access information, score information that they're given, the information arm seems to be working only for those schools. But again, we're in the process of figuring this out a little more. So just to summarize the heterogeneity results, we found that students especially respond well to realistic but ambitious goals communicated to them in the form of very high expectations. In the peer treatment arm, we see significantly positive effects for those whose randomly matched pair is similar to them. And the effects of the information arm, though they're statistically insignificant, they persist in the long run, but only in schools with lower parental literacy. We also had pre-specified other heterogeneity in our pre-analysis plan, but we don't find any differential treatment effects by other students' characteristics such as gender, younger or older cohorts, baseline performance, even like some noisy estimates on baseline effort. But this is the overall summary of our heterogeneity results. So next steps, we want to better understand the mechanisms behind the results. So for example, we would really like to know and understand how students update their beliefs about their ability after they receive information about their scores and about the teacher's expectations. So we have, with our partner school, planned some focus group sessions with the teachers and hopefully students to find out how they're interpreting the various treatments. And also we've exploited some school characteristics, but there are other things that we'd like to look at to better understand the information, the effects of the information arm. So that would be all from me. But before I end, I'd really like to thank our partner schools for their collaboration and facilitation of this research. Also, very, very thankful to RISE Pakistan and JPAL for their financial support, our research team at CREB, Amara and Umar for their participation, and then we've presented preliminary work at various conferences and seminars. So thankful to those people as well. And my email address is here, so is Ronak's and Vatsal. If you have any comments that you would like to share, we would be very happy to have them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Minahil. It was a great talk. I will now jump to my...
Shaheen, I managed in 25.
Oh, yes.
I sped through most of it, but I managed.
Yes, great. All right, I would take 5 minutes, followed by 5 minutes by Christina Brown, and then we will just open the floor for question and answer. All right, so just to recap, so summarize the paper. So the goal of this paper is to look at the causal evidence, to provide causal evidence that teachers' expectation can impact student achievement. So the method that authors use is randomized controlled trial in Pakistan. It's a classroom level randomization. I will not recap the treatments on student, but there are 3 different treatments followed by placebo group. And the outcome that they're looking at is impact on test scores. So to begin with the contribution of the paper, I thought it's an excellent paper adding to the burgeoning literature. And it shows that, and I would say certainly we already know a lot about this literature, that student stage in the school is the time when their brain is very impressionable. So that's when their brain is very elastic and malleable. So, really giving these intervention at that stage is already, I would say, super cool. So I would really like to congratulate the authors to do this wonderful work. It's a prime example of building on the previous study, find a positive impact, teacher at the heart of education system, and teachers' expectation of student effect, student attainment. So I would say this literature on growth mindset, teachers as role models. So it briefly or implicitly also touches that literature. So a great contribution of paper is that it's not only looking at the self-reported survey, but also providing the outcome and the impact of treatments on math scores. Some minor comments on the contribution that it shows great heterogeneity that Minahil explained in the end of her talk across different variables, for example, peer score, peer expectation, teacher expectation. That was super cool. And what I really liked about your treatment is that you are reinforcing by sending the reminders at different stages. All right, some of the question, again, as Minahil, you mentioned in your talk as well, that it's work in progress. So most of these comments are more, not questions, but some suggestions. So I would say that it would be a good idea to talk in detail about the theoretical interpretation, because as you said, that it's a light touch intervention. And then we see impact on student scores. So it would be really nice to see what is driving the results. So what are the channels? So what do you think, that the treatment is actually changing the attitude or the effort level or the information friction via teachers' expectation? So I would say, certainly it would be difficult to establish causation, and I don't know how much flexibility do you have to really check these different channels, but some discussion about the theoretical interpretation in the paper would be a good idea. Also, it would be a good idea to look at students and teachers' absenteeism and study time. So both at extensive and intensive margin, because this would also show that whether they got more interested to learn more about mathematics, and it also had impacted their attendance in the class. Some of the mechanism that I was thinking about when I was reading your paper, that maybe you would like to talk about the literature on this effort and reward relationship. And as we know that effort and reward relationship is flat, so maybe you would like to look at the heterogeneity across test score. And you already have data on like midterm and then final term. And then you see that if I perform like, let's say A minus, and my teacher expectation was like B plus, and I performed better than the expectation. So whether it has like negative externality, positive externality, or no impact. And the other mechanism maybe that you would like to talk about would be whether it changed the attitude again, the way they should act in the class. Like again, the expectation you also mentioned in your talk, that it updated the belief of student, or it's just like this, that, they are taking more pressure. So, looking at the positive side or the negative side, because I guess your results, the negative impact of treatment on English test score were very striking. So is it more because they are taking more pressure that I need to perform, or it's actually the change in positive, in the attitude in positive sense, or and message that teacher cares. So again, like looking at this, that this message has negative connotation or positive. I guess that would be very interesting to look at that. Some other minor comments that, as you mentioned in your talk as well, that you don't see the effect of peer treatment. And I thought one of the interpretation could be that increased the competition rather than coordination. And to really unpack that, you could maybe play some incentivized games with students, that when people, they are participating in these different games standalone. So the difference between when you are clubbed or you're participating in a group. So that could be one mechanism to experimentally unpack that. What could be other potential outcome other than test score? For example, again, like improvement in non-cognitive abilities, grit, or so many other soft skills that you could measure. Some minor comments in paper, it would be a good idea to explain minimum effect size and maximum effect size. And maybe you're already thinking about adding that in your appendix, because it's a class room level randomization. So it would be interesting to know that what were your expectations. And sorry, I missed this point that you have already looked at heterogeneity across gender. And I thought you said in your talk that because of the cultural reasons, you didn't include the mixed gender peer group. But since you are looking at the primary school level, so maybe it would be also a good idea to make mixed gender groups, because then we can really see that whether when they are participating in these study groups in groups, so heterogeneity across gender would be an interesting dimension, whether gender desegregation or segregation has any impact on the expectations. So I would stop here, and overall wonderful work, and thanks so much. I really enjoyed reading your paper. Yes, Christina, over to you.
Great. Excellent. So really excited to get to discuss this paper. Can you see my slides okay?
Yep.
Great. So I wanted to use the few minutes that I had to just kind of take a step back and think a little bit about, there's, I think, some really, really interesting findings in this paper, and kind of as was hinted at in the last kind of third of the talk, you know, there's, I think, some of the findings also bring up some questions of really trying to understand, you know, why was the information treatment also have such powerful effects? Why did the peer treatment arm seem to, you know, not overall have an effect, but maybe depending on who you were compared to, what the kind of relative population you were compared to, it had a bigger or smaller effect. So trying to kind of square some of those results, as well as, I think, hopefully provide some ideas for future research. It definitely had me thinking of kind of as Shaheen was saying, you know, what are the underlying mechanisms that are driving this result? I think that there's a lot of interesting future work. So that's what I wanted to talk through a little bit. So the first thing I think, kind of as I was going through and looking at the paper and some of the findings, is that, you know, there's really two things that are happening. In the cases for kids who are just getting the information treatment, they're learning some information about their own performance. They're probably, to a certain extent, updating their priors about what their current ability is in math, you know, assuming that this wasn't kind of publicly available information that they would have already known about their own performance. And then in the teachers' expectations and peers group, they're, you know, again, probably updating to some extent the expectation that teachers have of them. And depending on what their prior was, you know, this could be that they're updating positively or negatively, right? They're, you know, in the absence of this information, maybe they had some beliefs about what their performance was currently, what their teachers' expectations were. Since I think the framing of this was probably such that the teacher's expectation was probably higher maybe than it would have been in the absence of information, they're probably mostly positively updating on that front. But in terms of their own performance, you know, they could be negatively updating. They could be learning that, oh, actually their scores are a bit worse than they had thought they were going to be. And so there's, you know, this updating relative to whatever their prior is that could have different effects. And then that's going to affect, you know, what they believe are the perceived returns to studying, to paying attention in class, and so on. And so just thinking through a little bit of kind of, you know, what are the different ways that this updating process might kind of, what the relationship look like between changes in beliefs and ultimate, you know, changes in behavior. These are just me kind of brainstorming last night. I imagine there's other potential channels that could be at play, but I think some of these are interesting. It also kind of highlights the fact that, you know, I think as a field, we don't have a great understanding of the extent to which, you know, if you learn that you're actually doing much better than you thought you were, does that make you work harder, or does that make you work less hard? Like, some of these mechanics, I think, are not, you know, well understood. So the main kind of channels that I can think through on the benefit side, in terms of basically, you know, kind of trying to understand the, you know, returns to working hard. I think one kind of class of channels that could be at play are the role of identity. So, you know, we know that it's students form kind of, you know, self-identity, especially related to specific subjects, so they have a sense of whether they're good at a particular subject or bad at a particular subject. And those perceptions tend to persist over time. And so this information about their current score might, you know, either be kind of misaligned with what their current belief about their identity is. So let's say, they think that, they have this core identity that they're a student that's good at math and the score is lower than they expected. That might then cause them to change their behavior to realize, oh, actually, I need to work harder because my current performance isn't aligning with what my deep held identity belief about my ability in this subject is. But the information could also cause the student to update their identity. It could cause them to say, oh, actually, wow, my score is a lot higher than I thought it was. I'm actually better at math than I thought I was. And then similarly change their behavior as a result. So there could be these two things kind of at play, either the gap between their existing identity kind of conception or an updating identity status. The expectations piece could also, have an effect on, what they do, because again, there's, especially at this age, I think some pressure to, meet teachers' expectations or to see them as someone who is kind of holding them to a certain level of performance. And so it could be that this information either, again, positively or negatively updated their priors about their teachers' expectations of them. That could, one, cause them to kind of change their behavior to meet that expectation, seeing that, wow, my teacher thinks that I can get an A at the end of the year, therefore I should work harder. But it's also possible that it could backfire in some ways too, right? Imagine, you learn that, wow, my teacher thinks that I can get an A. I don't really, need to get an A. I'm okay with getting a B, so I'll work a little bit less hard, right? Like my teacher thinks I'm on track to do really well. And so you could have this kind of interesting dynamic happening too. On the cost side, you could also imagine that, through learning about their current performance and learning about their teachers' expectations of them, they're coming to understand their own production process of studying. So, imagine they're seeing on their performance that, their score was lower than they thought it was. They might then learn that, wow, they studied really hard for that midterm and I still got a really low score. Actually the returns to studying are, lower than I thought they were, or vice versa. And so in both giving them information about their current performance and the expectations, they could basically, have some updating about understanding, what is actually the kind of functional form of their own studying process and whether it's worth it or not. So I think these are just some potential, again, I think not stuff to do with necessarily the current analysis, but I think that this definitely, gives me ideas and hopefully others in the room ideas for future work to do. So thank you so much. It was really thought-provoking paper.
Thank you, Christina. Minahil, I would suggest you take more and more questions. And
So
what would you prefer?
No, I thought
Sorry?
you were also waiting for Sarthak. Sarthak, do you? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
No, I mean, I just had a couple of, so the first time I'm seeing the paper, very interesting. Thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering a couple of things. Firstly, I think Christina already mentioned that we want to know about the priors and how people actually updated. And a related question is, what happened to the whole distribution? So were there larger effects at the lower end or at the upper end? I mean, that would be very interesting to see. And then in my view, I didn't think the kind of pure non-effect was very surprising, because if you're matched to a random student in the classroom, I would not expect them to work together really. But the fact you find that friends or similar students actually find positive effects, I think you can kind of explain that very nicely. The mechanism is there. But then relatedly, you find that the English score suffers in the peer treatment, which is interesting. I was wondering if you have effort data. Do you know how much time they spent? So is there substitution across maths or English, that kind of stuff? That would be useful to know, because if there's no impact on math scores, but negative impact on English scores in the peer group, is it suggesting that some children were kind of negatively affected by the thing in certain ways? I mean, that would come out from the distribution also. And then finally, the point you made about there's actually more positive effects if you have very high expectations versus high expectations. Were you just comparing betas there, or when you're comparing two betas, two treatment effects? I think that's another separate kind of exercise. So are you saying that difference is statistically significant, or is it just that the coefficient is different? We can, yeah, that was my initial reactions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Lots to think about, lots of questions. So I can try to start off with I think the common theme among all the questions. It is really that how the students are perceiving this information and then updating their identity and or belief or effort in once they receive this information. So I mean, we will do a theory model as you've suggested, Shaheen. So, I mean, Vatsal's here, and maybe if you'd like to speak more about this, but there is, we do want to theorize it in a way that explains all these different mechanisms that are in place. So one thing that we did do, again, like this idea that what is the prior? So where do they stand? What do they think that where they really are at this point? So we do a proxy for that in some ways and try to look at things. So for example, variation in the classroom variation in baseline performance, and even the quantile treatment effects, I'm happy to show those. And we see that students who are in the middle of the distribution, who we anticipate are more uncertain about their own academic performance, we see that there actually are larger effects there. So maybe I can just take a minute to show you that slide here. So, you know, at the midterm, you do see that those who are in the middle of the distribution, perhaps more uncertain about where they stand in terms of their ability and performance, are responding well, but these effects don't last till the end line. So again, like lots of things for us to think about and see and ways to do it.
Minahil, I would suggest that we take more questions.
Okay.
And yeah, yes.
Even more. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Happy to take more questions.
Yes. So anyone, any questions? And our audience, please write your questions and I'm happy to read for you. Okay. Yes. Satik, I see you have another question.
I mean, I can just be at the back of the queue. I'll wait for other people if they are.
Yeah. All right. So maybe, yeah, just go ahead, Satik. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, this is not crucial, but I was just wondering, were teachers actually correct? So you ask what the expectation is, and you have the N9 test scores. Were these actual expectations were accurate? And so there are, like, I know a recent paper from India, for example, where they find that 40% of teachers in India in primary schools think that students in their school, in their classroom, have learning abilities, but they don't. So, I mean, teachers overestimate some of the expectation in the classroom. They are like under times underestimate and so on. So I'm just curious what happens here if they're actually expecting correctly.
So we don't actually look at whether the teacher's expectations match the outcomes, but we do look at the fact that these expectations are not biased. So, you know, by gender, by stereotypes, which is why we give them these conditional expectations. So we give them the score and ask them to report an expectation based off of that score. We've also collected unconditional expectations, which we did before we gave them this sheet that had their score. So there is some stuff that we would like to do that looks at some of their biases and then see whether those influence how students actually perform, but at this point we haven't looked at whether they were accurate. But that's a good point.
Related to this, Minahil, another point which was coming to my mind. So here we have private school. Do you expect a different result in the first generation learner schools, for example, in the public schools? So do you think expectations are better communicated in private school because already like these are second or third generation learner students? And how do you see the heterogeneity across these different schools? Your thoughts, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So, you know, when I said that we started this paper really long ago, like 3 years ago, that's when I met Christina in Berkeley for the first time and I was telling her about it. I remember we wanted to do this in public schools. I think there's a lot to be said about how expectations are made in public schools, and the issue of stereotypes is much higher there. So, you know, I always give this example, ke hum kuch public school, I'm going to just switch to Urdu here, but hum kuch public schools ke teachers se mil मिले और उन्होंने कहा ये रिक्शे वाले का बेटा ये रिक्शे वाला ही बनेगा. I think that's something that really stuck with us, and we were like, okay, so like these expectations then eventually matter and influence. So I don't think we can generalize the context that we're working in to a larger audience, a larger public school audience, but I think eventually we would like to do something like this in public schools. I think there's a lot to be learned there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's a question. There's some questions in the chat, and then somebody's raised their hand as well.
Yes, Javed Malik. So maybe if we can unmute. So I can read this question actually. So Javed Malik says that I think the institutional factor would matter, and so would be actual teaching, which will explain why students scored well in math but lesser in English. And especially when in post-COVID world, when even public sector system has started online support to support teachers, which can be further improved too. So if I understand correctly, the impact of this virtual and in-person mode of teaching. So do you see any impact of this?
So I think there's, within the context of our experiment, there were intermittent school closures. Some schools were completely online, but there were other schools that were doing some stuff in person. So I would count all of that in some school level variation factors that we still haven't explored. And one of the last points on our slides was that we want to work with the partner organization and try to see if we see heterogeneity by those things. So if some schools transitioned to online better, does that influence how expectations are received? If some schools were able to do a hybrid model better, does that influence our outcome? So yes, I think those are all good questions to think about as we move forward. But sir, is there anything you'd like to add to all these questions now that you're here?
That's good. Thank you so much for joining. And yeah.
No, thanks so much for the invite. And no, just to add to the previous point about whether we can say anything about public schools, and to this point about whether we can say anything about the online modality versus the sort of the in-person modality, I don't think we can generalize in either of those two cases to those specific scenarios, but there is sufficient variation within the schools of our sample, whether it's about ease of access to technology. So there are some schools where technology and this online modality was not easily accessed by students and parents compared to those where it was. And also some schools resemble public schools in certain characteristics versus some schools don't, in terms of how they receive report cards, for example, etc. So that kind of data we are collecting we are planning to collect from the schools at the moment. And like Minahil showed you the parental literacy results. So we'll have more sort of results using that variation in school characteristics to be able to somehow comment on these things.
Yeah. And the big picture question, and that could be another experiment, I would say, that to horse race this teacher level randomization, that if you start like, if you would like to add something on this, that what do you think about transmission from teachers to student, and then looking at that if let's say that giving treatment to teachers, that how to best communicate your expectations. Again, as I said, that would be a separate experiment, but it would be interesting to hear from you that what are your thoughts about this mechanism, another channel.
So Shaheen, I would say that if we go back to our partner schools and tell them we want to do another experiment, they will murder us. They do not want to work with us anymore. But on a serious note, I think that, so we had all of these ideas about giving teachers the results of this intervention and telling them, and in some survey experiment way, try to see if you get this information, do you actually start giving expectations or not? And, are there ways to exploit something there? So yes, you're right. I think there's a lot that can be done with teachers. Maybe now is not the time. Maybe in a year we'll be able to better negotiate another experiment. But you're right. I think there's something to be said about randomizing at the teacher level, or giving teacher the information that, oh, something like this intervention, it works. Would they then end up actually giving expectations to students?
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. So we still have few minutes if we have any questions, or Christina, would you like to add anything? Dr. Azam, if you have any comment on this area, which is like, yeah.
Maybe I can take a minute to
Take
just
the
respond to a few things that were in the discussion. I took notes. I don't know if my memory will allow me to be able to respond to all of them. But I think one thing that maybe it was Shaheen, you or Christina, now I don't remember, raised is this gap between what the student themselves expect themselves to do versus what the teacher expects them to do. So we haven't elicited the gap, we haven't elicited students' own expectations, but we did ask students what they think the teacher expects of them. And we don't see any differences in those yet, but I think like that's something to be thought about. Like, how do we explain it, this difference? And another question about effort that keeps coming in. So we did ask students about, how much how much time do they spend in a week doing math, homework, studying for math, for their math exam, etc. But we're not powered to detect effects there. We find some noisy estimates when we look at baseline effort. So we find that students who were exerting low effort to begin with, they benefit more from the individual treatment. But again, it's, I think we're picking and choosing at this point. So we do want to have a more coherent story before we can say anything consequential from those results. So, and another thing, Shaheen, so we really wanted to, for younger grades, really wanted to randomize across gender and have girls and boys work together, but the partner schools did not allow us, even for grade 3. It was
in the classroom, they have mixed gender, right?
So some classrooms are mixed gendered, some classrooms are different, boys and girls. And we haven't, I think that's one thing that we could potentially look at, like differences between classrooms that are one gender versus classrooms that are mixed gendered. We haven't looked at that. That would be really interesting to see, but no, we were not able. We would have really liked to, but we were not able to do it in the context. And then I think there was one comment about like looking at student absenteeism as a mechanism or mediator. I'm not sure if we have data for that, but I think that could be really interesting. Like, are students actually show, maybe it's not an effect on actual scores, but some behavioral measure. I think absenteeism would be interesting to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so if we do not have any further questions.
Sorry. Could I quickly clarify one thing?
Yes,
so
sure.
you just mentioned that you have beliefs of students about what their teacher believes their ability is. Isn't that precisely what we are after? I think that's the belief you're updating, right? So if you have the first stage then, so you have what students initially believe, what their teacher thinks they are capable of. You update this belief, and that's exactly the first stage. So I think you have the required belief, unless I misunderstood.
Yeah, no, I think we do, but I can't remember at the top of my head, but I think every student thinks that their teacher thinks they will score 100% or something like that. I think there's no variation in that.
I see.
So I think we weren't really able to exploit that, but yes, I think you're right. Which also reminds me, you also asked a question about like the differences between very high and high. So no, those are not statistic. They're not distinguishable from each other, but from the pure control is where we see effects.
Right.
So if there's a couple of minutes, I had one other idea. I'm not sure if it's possible with the data, but it would be amazing to have exogenous variation in the current performance score that you're providing kids and the expectations. Now, of course, since these are based on actual data, there's going to be lots of other confounds, but I was thinking, depending on for either the baseline test or the midline test, if either of these are tests that, for example, the teacher wrote for themselves or there's different versions of the test by grade or something like that, where you can basically get an instrument for, this is a tough grader or an easy grader when you compare it to, for example, a standardized test. Then you might be able to then get an instrument for current performance to basically see, if you're learning about your performance and it's, you're getting a negative shock because you happen to have a teacher who is a tough grader, or you have to get a version of a test because, the second grade test was very difficult, but the third grade test wasn't. That would be nice, exogenous variation. Similarly, you might be able to do something on teacher expectations. I imagine that there's some teachers who, have systematically, lower expectations for their entire class. And so using that, again, there might be some other, exclusion restriction violations, but maybe thinking through the extent to which you can get some exogenous variation on both of those, that would be really cool to be able to have.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is very helpful.
Great.
This was so helpful. Thank you.
I guess with this, we can close this session. And thank you so much, Minahil, for joining us. I guess it was super interesting talk and really enjoyed it. And it was a spectacular session. And I would like to thank our panelists. And thank you so much, Vitsal, for joining as well. And thank you to the audience for joining this session and late evening in Pakistan. So I'm very thankful for people who have joined us from Pakistan and very early morning for many of us. Thanks so much for joining. And I hope and wish that good work in economics of education keeps on coming. We push this field forward. And as Christina rightly said, that we still need to know a lot that what is driving these different results. So this field really needs a lot of interesting work, further work. So thank you very much. With this positive note, I would like to say you goodbye and thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minahil. Thank you, Shaheen. And it was a great session. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.